So please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Good morning, Wachie, Michelle Nishinikazan, and Chikamau Duchin. We already did acknowledgements. Jim did his acknowledgements this morning, but as a guest in this territory, it's only my second time here. I also wanted to give my acknowledgements and my thanks as well this morning. And so I want to thank the lawful and original caretakers of this land in the surrounding waters of this territory, the Blackfoot Nation, as well as the people of the Treaty 7, including the, and I hope I'm going to get the pronunciation right on all of these, the Siksika, the Bikini, the Ganai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including the Chickasee, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. And I also want to acknowledge, as Jim did, that the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of the Region 3, and so I also want to acknowledge the Métis Nation and give them thanks for allowing us to be here today. And I want to thank Elder Wallace Alexson for the opening and for his smudge this morning and starting us off in a good way. And I would also like to thank the organizers of this seminar, particularly Jim for inviting me to be here today, and also Charla for arranging all of my travel, getting me here. And also, of course, I want to thank all of you for being here today and taking part in this very important discussion on water. So as I started to put together this presentation, I had a couple questions in mind that the organizers had posed when they invited us all to be here. Specifically, how do we think or rethink our relations to water? And also, how do we complicate this notion of human rights to water by thinking about our responsibilities and accountabilities to water? But also for me, it's also about thinking about our accountabilities to our animal, plant, and human relatives that we're also connected to through our waterways. And so I'm going to start to reflect on these questions by focusing on water relations that I'm most intimately familiar with. I'm going to focus on those in Mushkegowuk territory or Cree territory, what's now known as the Treaty 9 in Northern Ontario. And I'm specifically going to focus on Mushkegowuk relationships with the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers. Now, the Treaty 9, I should note, is home to Mushkegowuk, so Cree people, but also Ojibwe and Oji Cree people. But as a Mushkegowuk person, I'm going to speak specifically from that position of being a Mushkegowuk woman. And I'm going to start with some stories and of my home territory and of my family, and then hopefully work my way to some bigger questions that I hope will resonate with others in terms of what Indigenous water relations are, but also what we share in terms of the struggles that we're facing in terms of protecting our water relations today. My kukum and my musum, my grandmother and my grandfather, Angela and Bert Moore, they were born in the 1920s, just around the James Bay. And my grandmother was born in Fort Albany First Nation, and my grandfather was born in Kashatchewan First Nation. And so we see Cache here, and Fort Albany is just a little bit south of Cache. And so both of these communities are located right on the Albany River. So my grandparents spent a lot of time on the Albany River while they were growing up. And my grandfather has since passed, but my grandmother's still with us today, and she's 90 years old. And every summer, they would leave Cache and Fort Albany with their families, and they would spend the majority of the summer traveling up and down the Albany River. They would fish for pickerel and pike, they would pick berries, they would snare rabbits, and towards the end of the summer, moving into the fall, they would go, they would hunt for ducks and geese. And this is a time when they could still drink water directly from the river. And during that time, they would, as they were traveling up and down the river, they were visiting many different place names on the Albany River, which they actually know as Kashatchewan. And many of these place names hold stories of our people. And during that time, they would also renew their relationship with Kashatchewan through ceremony. And they would also meet with other Mushkegowuk families at the forks where Saskatchewan meets the Kanagami River. And while they met there at the forks, they would just get caught up on local news. They would visit with relatives. They would discuss a lot of important issues that were coming up in the territory that they weren't necessarily able to discuss during the winter months when a lot of families were out on their trap lines. And this was also a time when they would trade food towards the end of the summer before the fall and the winter. And it was also a time when they would feast. And it was really this time being out on Saskatchewan that really kind of informed them of how they would then relate with the Albany River and relate with other bodies of water on our home territory, how they would relate with the deer and how they would relate with fishing. So knowing where to fish, how much to fish, which species of fish they could fish at certain times of the year, and from year to year, kind of observing those changes as well, right? And that's really how they learned what we could call maybe natural law, but what I really kind of think of as Cree law, and how we learn that by our embodied experiences by being out on the land and out on the water. So my grandparents, like many other Mushkegowuk people, maintained their relationship with Saskatchewan, even as they were forced to attend residential school. My grandmother attended St. Anne's Residential School in Fort Albany, and my grandfather attended St. Joseph's, which was a little bit further south. And they continued to maintain that relationship as well as young adults as they took up jobs within the Canadian economy. Many men within Treaty 7, for example, were taking up jobs in pulp and paper mills and lumber mills in the early to mid 20th century. And a lot of the women were taking up jobs within the domestic sphere, supporting their husbands. And they were also taking up a lot of seasonal work as well. For example, my grandmother would go tree planting during the summer months. And so this time that they spent, particularly the men that worked in the lumber mills in the summer, so they would trap in the winter and work in the mills in the summer, that would take time away from them being out on Saskatchewan, being out on the land and on the water. But they took every moment that they could to go and renew that relationship. And I think it's important, in this era of TRC that we highlight those moments of ongoing renewal and resistance that happen even as dispossession was happening and continues to happen. That there's always that Indigenous resistance and renewal of relationships that's happening at every scale. So this is also a time in which Mushkegowuk relationships with water and their ability to govern and protect water is increasingly brought under the Canadian or colonial legal and institutional frameworks. And for example, in 1929 and 1930, there are adhesions that are made to the Treaty 9 agreement, the James Bay Agreement. Now, the Treaty 9 agreement was signed in 1905 and 1906 originally, and the adhesions in 1929 and 30 partly pertain to territorial adhesions. So there's territory that's being added to Treaty 9 during this time. But there's also changes in the language within the official treaty documents. And for the first time, there's language that's included on water, because there was no language at all on water in the original documents. But the inclusion of water in the official documents is really to secure and legitimate the Canadian government's access to Mushkegowuk territory for capitalist development, and specifically for resource extraction. And I just have this quote here that's from the Treaty 9 documents. It's taken out of a book written by a historian, John Long. There's been a lot of work going on in Treaty 9 right now to go back to the treaty documents and look how they were negotiated and signed, and really looking at the unlawfulness of how the treaty came to be, and the ongoing negotiations that are taking place within Treaty 9 right now. So for many elders in Mushkegowuk territory, they continue to worry about the well-being of Saskatchewan and other bodies of water in our home territory, and specifically disruptions to Mushkegowuk people's ability to renew our relationships with water and to protect and govern our local waterways as they're becoming entangled in the newest wave of resource extraction that's now taking place. Currently, the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers are entangled in proposed mining developments that have been dubbed the Ring of Fire, a development project that will span 5,000 square kilometers and was reported to be the largest chromite deposit in North America, with an estimated value of $30 billion. And they've also found graphite and copper and nickel in the area, and there's also speculation that they may find more diamonds. There's the Victor diamond mine that's already been in operation there for a few years now, just outside of Attawapiskat First Nation. In 2015, nearly 24 companies held claims on Mushkegowuk territory, and nearly $300 million had been spent in mining exploratory drilling alone. We've already seen rising mercury levels in Treaty 9, and specifically rising mercury levels in the Albany and Attawapiskat rivers. Now, this is tied to an extensive history of the lumber industry in Treaty 9, but this mercury that was already sitting within those rivers is now being released through the new mining activity, specifically the mining activity at the Victor mine, but also the series of exploratory drillings that are now taking place. And it's crucial to note that these rising mercury levels are disproportionately impacting Indigenous women and youth and unborn children in the territory. Women are reporting increased rates of infertility, birth deformities, and miscarriages. And we're also now seeing rising rates of autism in Treaty 9 that are being tied to the rising mercury levels. And we do need to do more work on this and kind of investigate those connections as well. And that work is being done, but more needs to be done. So as individual First Nation communities are issued impact benefit agreements for these various mining developments, many elders are urging us to think about our decision in relation to water, our responsibilities and accountabilities to water, but also in relation to our extended kinship networks. For example, Stanley Stevens from Constance Lake First Nation asks, how are the people downriver, down the Albany River, how are they going to be affected if we support these developments? How is that going to affect their ability to hunt, trap, and fish? It's not just us that will be affected, us in Constance Lake First Nation, it's them too. And so Constance Lake is right here on the map. This is my community. And what he's talking about is how are the communities downriver, actually up the map, in Fort Albany and Cache, how are they going to be impacted as well? We have many relatives that come from there. My grandparents were born there. And so what are our responsibilities then in terms of making these decisions as we're being issued an impact benefit agreement for a mine? And I've also thought about this a lot because I've had the honor to spend time in Anishinaabe territory known as Treaty 3. And as I was there a couple of years ago and a lot of these negotiations were taking place, a lot of community members from Anishinaabe territory were asking me, what's going on up there? What does your band and council want to do about this? What do they think about it? And what do you think about it? What does your family think about it? And it really made me think about how a lot of these decision-making processes are confined within colonial jurisdictions of the reserve, but also of the treaty territories that, yes, reflect in part our understandings of what our ancestral territories are, but that really don't reflect how governance, I think, actually happened pre-settlement and pre-colonization. So I start with these stories and these everyday and embodied experiences with water because they've taught me how water is inscribed with multiple relationships, but also how water cultivates relationships across multiple scales. And while these stories are specific to Mushkegowuk territory, my sense is from having the honor to visit other Indigenous territories and living and working on other Indigenous territories, that there's a lot of commonality across different Indigenous nations, communities, and families in terms of how we think about water and how we relate to water. Elder Wallace started this morning by saying that water is life. And when he says that, it's not just that water is subsistence in the most kind of surface level and basic way, but that water is our grandmother, and she is our kin and our relative. and that we have to renew our relationship with her, just like I have to renew my relationship with my human kin. And more than this, water as kin is in and of itself a legal actor, just like we all are as humans legal actors, and that we can't forget that. Indigenous law that extends further back than colonialism, than European settlement, and then Canadian law, and in my case, Cree law, is learned and transmitted through water. This happens at the most intimate scale through direct and cyclical experiences with water, through ceremony, and it gets scaled outward. It gets built outward as those laws then guide our interactions in terms of how we govern and manage water, how we relate with our animal and plant relatives, and with each other, with our relatives, our kinship networks that we're connected to through our waterways. But these stories also tell us how our water relations and our ability to uphold our responsibilities to water have been disrupted through historical and ongoing the ongoing impacts of colonialism, and specifically settler colonialism here within Canada. And when I say settler colonialism, I'm referring to colonialism having a distinct character within particular nations like Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand, where the objective was not just capitalist development, but permanent settlement, and permanent settlement that occurred here in Canada in the late 19th century. And that there's an ongoing need on behalf of the Canadian state to legitimate that settlement and to legitimate that Canadian or that capitalist development, and that continues to happen through various legal frameworks. And so when I think of how dispossession of Indigenous water relations continues to happen in Mushkegowuk territory, I think of Bill C-45 that impacts many Indigenous territories, that made sweeping changes to the Navigable Waters Protection Act. But I also think of various laws that pertain to Ontario, as we're subjected to laws within that jurisdiction. So the Ontario Water Resources Act and the Ontario Protection Act and the Environmental Assessment Act that all work together in terms of how water is managed and governed with regards to proposed infrastructural developments such as mines and hydroelectric projects. But then these come into relation with treaty agreements that then bring in larger questions of sovereignty and autonomy over Indigenous territories. Now, so as I said, these questions, I start from a place that I know well, but many people from different Indigenous territories are asking the same questions. And I just wanted to kind of finish off by highlighting this one project that is bringing together people from different disciplinary backgrounds. It's called the Decolonizing Water Project. And it's a SSHRC funded grant. It's a Connections partnership grant. And it's bringing together academics, but also community members from various backgrounds. And so there's academics who specialize in Indigenous law and governance. There's also practicing lawyers on the grant. There's scientists who do water monitoring. And there's also Indigenous artists that are teaching us about Indigenous water laws through their artwork. And one of the project's long-term objectives is to create self-sustaining water and ecological water monitoring programs that will enhance the protection of water relations and water resources. But that's not the sole focus of the project. One of the other objectives is to think about how Indigenous law, and specifically Indigenous water law, can be incorporated into these water monitoring programs, into the creation and implementation. And then how does that Indigenous water law even kind of complicate this notion of what monitoring is, right? Is it just kind of taking a sample, measuring a sample and measuring the different sediments that are within that sample? Or is it also actually engaging at the community level and asking people how their relationships with water have changed, kind of looking at that deeper, more intimate level and asking questions around dispossession, but also the ongoing renewal of Indigenous law within our communities. And I guess just because we're talking about the TRC today as well, and also I just wanted to kind of maybe build on what Adrian mentioned earlier in terms of, well, how do we then kind of address some of these issues of water in terms of thinking about it as water being part of the commons, right? That it's a common right. And I think it's really crucial to recenter the importance of Indigenous law in terms of how we're thinking about the commons. And so yes, water is common to all of us, and it becomes something that I think is crucial in terms of building solidarities, as we saw and as Adrian mentioned at Standing Rock. But I think what is very unique and what we do see at Standing Rock is that we see people coming from these different communities, settler communities, other racialized communities, other Indigenous communities from the US and beyond, that are coming there and they're really honoring the authority that the Standing Rock Sioux have over that territory, and that they're honoring the long-standing political and legal orders of that nation. And so in thinking about the commons, I think we also have to think about that. And if we're really gonna honor what the TRC is in terms of decolonizing our relationships, we have to recognize that Indigenous people have been doing this work all along. This resistance and resurgence work has been going on all along. And it's been going on at the intimate scale within the community, and it's been going on within Canadian legal and political spaces. And that if we're really going to renew relationships, that this also means that Indigenous communities are renewing our relationships with each other, going back to that quote from Elder Stanley Stevens, but also that settler Canadians are thinking about, well, what does it mean for me to be accountable to the Indigenous political and legal orders of the territories that I come from, that I live and work on? So I guess I'll just finish with that. And I just want to say Miigwech, and I'm humbled to be here in this room with all of you and with all these speakers on this panel as well. Miigwech.